Good evening and welcome. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture, The Art of Fiction, which will be delivered by Mona Simpson, this semester's Anna Maria Kellen Fellow, and moderated by author and critic Lauren Euler. So we take our responsibility to acknowledge our progenitors very seriously here at the Academy. And I just want to say a word about the fellowship. The Anna Maria Kellen Fellowship is named after Anna Maria Kellen, who lived from 1918 to 2017, and she was one of the daughters of Hans and Ludmila Arnold, the purchasers and owners of this beautiful villa. She spent her childhood here in Berlin, and then continued her studies in Switzerland and France. When the Nazis came to power and the Arnold family emigrated to the United States, Anna Maria reestablished her life there. She married a young Berlin banker named Stephen M. Kellen, who also had to flee Germany. He later became the president of the family firm, Bankhaus Arnold und S. Bleichroder. I think it's absolutely safe to say that without Anna Maria Kellen and Stephen Kellen, we would not be here. And in 1997, the two of them made the founding gift to establish the American Academy in Berlin. For those of you who don't know the history of the house, this had been, during the post-war period, a U.S. Army officers club, and the U.S. Army is good at doing lots of things, but leaving buildings in good condition is not one of them. So they renovated it and created the basis for our endowment and have been supporting this institution with the greatest generosity ever since. And Anna Maria was deeply involved in the life of the Academy till the end of her life and really left a huge imprint upon it. And so we are enormously grateful for their generosity and their vision. And I have to say, it's a real pleasure to have Mona here as the Anna Maria Kellen Fellow. So Mona Simpson is a literary phenomenon, or as we say this time of year in the baseball world, a phenom. She's a phenom. And she has a large body of work that has deeply explored the lives of women and children. Over 7 novels, she has drilled down into the important questions about home, work, love, and family, and the way that the vast forces generated by the American economy and society shape people's circumstances and their dreams. As one writer has said, Mona Simpson captures the pain and joy and strangeness of being a person in a family. Her debut novel, Anywhere But Here, which came out in 1986, was not only critically acclaimed, but also adapted into a major motion picture in 1999, starring Susan Sarandon and Natalie Portman. And I mention that because I want Mona to get them to come visit. Mona has since published a series of celebrated novels, including The Lost Father in 1992, A Regular Guy 1996, Off Keck Road in 2000, which was a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award, and My Hollywood 2010, and a Casebook 2014. I wrote 2 books and they nearly killed me, so I'm really impressed. Her most recent novel, Commitment, was published just last year, and it's another powerful family story that considers all the ways, large and small, in which mental illness affects a family, as 3 siblings fend for themselves in the 70s after their mother enters a state psychiatric hospital. Mona's short stories have appeared in all the best places, in Harper's, The Atlantic, Granta, N+1, and others, and she is the recipient of a basket full of prizes, including a Whiting, the Mary McCarthy Prize, named after a writer I love, the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Prize, Chicago Tribune Heartland Prize, and the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has received a Guggenheim grant, another grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton. In addition to all these things, she does during the day. Mona serves as the publisher of the Paris Review, which is a place that she started working while a student completing her MFA at Columbia University. She teaches on the faculty of UCLA, and she teaches both small creative writing workshops and, to my mind, wholly admirably, a large annual lecture on Middlemarch, which everyone should be required to read as a condition of citizenship and voting. As impressive as all that is, she is not slowing down. And just before arriving here in Berlin, she submitted her last novel, Help, and its sequel. And I guess a lot of creativity is given to a few people, and she arrived here with not just one, but 3 new ideas for novels, all of which will be done by the time she leaves. Anyway, this evening she'll be talking to us about what it's like to begin a new project and all that comes with starting a novel from scratch. So Mona will deliver her talk, and then she will be joined by Lauren Euler, who's right up here, for a conversation about the process of beginning. Lauren is an American writer and a critic herself. Her debut novel, Fake Accounts, was published in 2021, and it was a New York Times Review Editor's Choice, and has gotten lots of encomia for its sharp and insightful commentary on social media. Social media deserves nothing less than sharp, very sharp and insightful commentary. After graduating from Yale in 2012, Lauren moved to Berlin, and she's been moving back and forth between here and New York. You're here permanently now, right? She's permanently here now. I'm sorry? You shipped all your books. That's the decisive moment. And she's also co-authored 2 books with Alyssa Mastromonaco, who is a fabulous part of the Democratic political Empyrean. And that was about Alyssa's time in the Obama administration. If you listen to Pod Save America, which I do religiously, you will hear Alyssa Mastromonaco frequently. Lauren has also published widely in Harper's, the Times Magazine, that is the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and elsewhere. And I'm told that I have to say that you are no stranger to controversy, and that your review of Gia Tolentano's Trick Mirror actually crashed the website of the London Review. Yeah. What kind of website do they have? Anyway, impressive nonetheless. What? It's a literary website. Yeah. It's not that. It's not extreme. Okay. It's her latest essay collection, No Judgment, was published just this year. So congratulations on that. Anyway, Lauren is also starting a book. I have to tell you my favorite fact about my new acquaintance, which is that she comes from the town of Hurricane, West Virginia. Is that okay? Am I allowed to tell people that? Hurricane tells you a lot. So she is going to gently interrogate Mona and see if we can find out about the creative process. And with that, Mona, it's all yours. If you have questions later, if you're here, just put up your hand in the normal way. If you're at home, use the Q&A part of the platform. Thank you very much.
Hey, Dan, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I want to thank the Academy for taking such good care of us, thinking of our every desire. We were offered, upon arrival, a pillow selection, and to the wonderful cooks. Thank you especially to my fellow fellows, each of whom I've learned from. Thanks also to Lauren Euler, the brilliant author of Fake Accounts and No Judgment, and to Linda Rossi, the Academy staff member who's looked after me here and who's just had her first novel accepted for publication. So We've got to all watch for that next year. I'm going to break a bit from the plan, and I'm going to read a story about a night like tonight, about giving a reading, not to strangers, but to people whom you know, whose opinions mean more to you than those of strangers. And so this is called The Reading. Most of the guests has been there long enough to know the rotation of desserts. Wednesday meant bread pudding, a favorite, which the kitchen lady, wearing a hairnet, served warm, pouring on cream until you told her to stop. 2 guests, one old and one young, had already asked for her recipe. People were beginning to think about going home. She'd written the ingredients in pencil. Nothing here was withheld from the guests. It was near the end of the season. Open studios, recitals, and readings were scheduled almost every evening. The stone mansion had been built by an early investor in electricity, but during the family's first summer in residence, one of the children drowned in the Hudson River. Eventually, their 2 remaining children lost to diphtheria. The couple left the estate to become a colony for writers, artists, and composers. In the years since its opening, lunch in picnic baskets has been delivered by staff to the individual studios and left outside their doors. 60 years proved long enough for the colony to claim one famous symphony, a series of drawings now in the Museum of Modern Art, more than one best-selling novel and prize-winning volume of poetry. Tonight, after the dishes and coffee cups were collected, a reading would take place upstairs on a porch off the parlor of what had once been the playroom. Nell, the youngest guest there, would read with Louise Davies, who'd arrived just a week ago. I lucked out, Nell had said, alone in her studio for the first time after 2 composers, both gay, had carried her suitcases from the taxi. The studio had a desk, a lamp, a fireplace, and bookshelves, and there was a separate bedroom. She'd never been on ground so opulent. In the afternoon, she walked by herself down to the gardens and picked raspberries off the bushes. In New York City, raspberries in paper-thin wooden boxes cost $11. Her second day there, she met a town kid on a John Deere mowing the endless lawns. Nell was 25 years old. At home, she'd lived in a 500-square-foot apartment, which she'd sublet for the summer at a profit. Tonight, she stood on the upstairs porch and poured a glass of water. There was nothing worse than the ticking minutes you waited just prior to performing and having your story judged. Everyone seemed to have gathered except the slender, dark-haired composer she kind of liked, who didn't go to anyone's performance so as not to have to go to all of them or to pick favorites. Even the famous poet from Kentucky was settling himself into a chair now next to his visiting wife. Then it was time to start. There was a question of who would go first. Nell said she didn't care either way. They could flip a coin or really whatever the other woman wanted. The other woman said, "Oh, why don't you go on ahead then?" Nell just then realized the other woman was wearing a dress. Nell had on cutoffs, but her legs were tan and freshly shaved, and she was wearing her good black shirt. She pulled her chair in closer to the table, lit the candle, and started to read her story, a story she told dozens of times before writing it down, and then, once she'd typed it, had tinkered with for almost a year. It was the last week of August, and summer leaves infiltrated by wind made sounds like an orchestra tuning. Nell hadn't practiced. She wouldn't have believed this before, but she could tell people were listening from a certain hush and concavity in the growing dark. She heard tributaries of wind in the dense trees. She just noticed the town boy, Brent, who visited her boyfriend twice a week, the nights he worked on the grounds, was standing in the shadows at the back. She hadn't told him about the reading. She knew for sure that the reading had gone over when she finished, and there was a sound from what seemed like She knew for sure that the reading had gone over when she finished, and there was a sound from what seemed the group as a whole, like a gasp before clapping. Then, showered with relief, which felt hilarious, she stood. People rose to compliment her and to get another drink. She found a chair in a back corner to listen to the other woman read. By now, the town boy was gone. The Southern woman was old, older than Nell's mother, who anyway never wore dresses. Her reading voice was lower than when she talked at meals, and she sounded more sure of herself. A brother and a sister lived together on the outskirts of town in a house where they'd grown up. They raised foxes and mink for their pelts. It was impossible for Nell to imagine her mother or grandmother in a place like this colony, having written a book and reading from it. In fact, this woman had written 5 or 6. Nell hadn't read any of them. She'd been more curious about the well-known books written by former guests. Most of the other artists, she gathered, wanted to read those books too because they were checked out of the colony's small library. The most famous person here now was the Kentucky poet. Nell had read a few poems from his recent collection standing up in the town bookstore. She hadn't gotten much out of them. They all seemed to be about scenery, like those pictures people took when they traveled and then never looked at because there were no people in them. She'd only gone to town a few times and strolled in and out of stores. There was nothing to buy, nothing even to want that you couldn't afford. Nell resumed listening, but found herself lost. There were other characters now, and the woman read quietly, slyly, and eventually Nell let her mind roam again into the pretty night. Then it was over, and people stood to pour themselves more wine or lukewarm soda water in plastic cups. They walked up to both women and told them how much they liked what they read. Nell stood in a blur, not really registering the praise. She was at the beginning of a ride, she began to understand. She sensed momentum unrolling before her like a red carpet. She had an overwhelming premonition that her life was going to change. She told the Southern woman that she liked her story. Did you really? Well, thank you. Thank you very much. The woman looked over at the Kentucky poet. Martin Harrigan hasn't said a thing to me, she said. He must not have liked it. Oh, I'm sure that wasn't it, Nell said, though she wasn't sure. He had come up to her, said fine work, and nodded like a benediction. But then she and the Kentucky poet had a nice thing. Nell could tell he was one of those men who liked her. She'd never slept with anyone that old. She wondered what it would feel like, the loose, soft skin. She'd considered it. Maybe he'd write a poem about her. But the Kentucky poet was a gentleman. He'd asked her to drinks with he and his wife at the town hotel where his wife was staying. They were standing up now to go. They were a pair. His khakis pleated, he wore a pressed shirt, her nails were polished a quiet pink. One of the young painters who made horizontal landscapes using egg tempera invited everyone to his studio. Nell wondered if the slender composer would join later. Just then, the Kentucky poet's wife scurried back from the door. I loved what you read, she whispered to the older woman. I can't wait to get my hands on the rest of the book. Then she hurried back to her husband, who'd kept walking. Louise, by now, was used to being the oldest person everywhere. The young painter called up to her on the stairs. Oh, come on, Louise, come for one drink. These young people were different from her own grown children. They read the same sections of the newspaper she read. She could change, she supposed, and go to the painter's studio, walk there under the moonlight. Her room was grand and still, a privilege of age, she assumed. She wished Martin Harrigan and his wife had asked her to have a drink. Or she would have liked to talk to the man from St. Louis, nearly her age, who always ate one poached egg on dry toast for breakfast. He left right after the reading, saying he had to move his clothes from the washing machine to the dryer. Nell, the young woman she'd read with, had had a sense of occasion. She'd brought her own candle to the small table, struck a match, and seemed to be reading by candlelight, though the sky had still been blue when she'd begun. She read a story ripe with lived emotion about an alcoholic father who repaired cars. Louise had liked the story. She compared Nell to her youngest daughter who'd gotten married this summer. Nell had had a rougher life. You could see it on her skin. Louise had noticed Martin Harrigan walk over to compliment her. She hadn't heard, but could imagine his praise. Martin hadn't been interested in the story, not really, Louise didn't think. He'd appraised the girl more than the story. Louise had been beautiful once too, or people had said she was. She'd grown up in a house with an ill parent. No one had had time for that kind of thing. But in college, other girls had claimed her. They'd shown her how to do her hair, told her which of her sweaters was becoming. She let all that go when she turned 40. It was too much work. Even back in the sorority, others had had more aptitude for it. Girls who knew how to adjust their dresses, have them lined. Louise hadn't known you could even have an unlined dress lined. There was a lot to it that she'd never learned. Martin Harrigan's silence had been deliberate. He listened to her read, and her story hadn't interested him. She didn't interest him either. They'd met once, years ago, at university, when she worked in the library. She'd known his name before she'd even seen him. She'd heard he was a poet. She'd imagined them together, a poet and a writer, though she hadn't told anyone yet about the stories she typed at night. But when she finally saw him, he'd handed her a book he wanted to check out, and he was tall, with moppy hair and freckles. He'd not noticed her, even at a time when most young men did. It must have been something deeper he'd sensed, some lack of bend, compliancy. Did she really even like his poems? If she took away the fame, she wondered, the tremble around his name. But here was the problem. Louise did like them. The one about falling on the stairs to the cellar, about his father building a fence. There was a payphone in the small room downstairs. When everyone else was asleep, she could call Jeffrey. When they talked, the chalky light of their square yellow kitchen came to her. She wouldn't tell him what happened. He wouldn't understand. He'd suffer thinking of her disappointment. Jeffrey wasn't a reader. But when the girls were small and she woke up mornings at 4, he came down to the kitchen table, made a cup of coffee, and sat with her. Nell had been walking on the dirt road to the painter's studio when she changed her mind. Though it was still a loud, starry night, the summer felt over. The town boy hadn't come up to her after the reading. He'd probably felt embarrassed to be there. She went to her room and gathered her last load of wash. At the laundry, Nell found an older painter who taught at a small college. He was leaving Saturday, he said. His wife would pick him up at the train station. She asked if they had children, just to say something. No, he said. He and his wife had made that sacrifice for his work. I see, Nell said, thinking she didn't want to end up like him. His work hadn't come to much, it seemed. This summer there had been painters here with galleries whose names she recognized. One, a Jackson Pollock type a generation or two late, showed at Knoedler. He'd bought everyone drinks in the town hotel. In his studio on the cement floor, he had tin pots on hot plates warming beeswax with pigment, infusing the cabin with the smell of honey. She'd slept with him on a messy futon, hoping that might turn into something. She'd already told the town boy, who smelled acutely of cut grass, that she couldn't hang out. She had a lot of work. But the painter blasted off before even a week. He'd left her one of his paintings on her pillow as a goodbye. Nell wondered if the painting was worth a lot of money. She needed pretty much everything: a better place to live, a boyfriend, a job. Nell decided to purchase an egg poacher when she returned home to mimic the breakfasts the kitchen lady had made for her here. She'd gotten her recipe for bread pudding too, though that would have to wait. Nell had only a hot plate in the converted closet that was her apartment's kitchen. In his wife's hotel room, Martin Harrigan sat smoking a pipe. You know, you might say something tomorrow to that lady from Georgia, his wife said. She noticed you didn't. He shook his head. I thought she was good, his wife went on the way she did. I've read one of her collections. Betsy told me about her. But he'd stayed true to himself, his standards, the ideal. You really liked that young woman's story more about the engine noises? I thought there was something there. It seemed to me there was a lot more in the other one. Funny, and in parts I nearly cried. I was shocked when the sister came back as a man. Well, and you galloped over and told her so. I'm glad I did, his wife said. Martin stayed up after his wife went to bed with a layer of white cream on her face. He'd recently retired from the college, and though there'd been a party, it hadn't been quite what he'd hoped. Several of his old students said generous things about his teaching, his help with their careers, less about his poems than he might have wished. He had won his share of prizes. He was not unaware of being the writer most kowtowed to here. It was because of his name that the old lady from Georgia had wanted him to compliment her. But his own most recent prize was already a decade ago, and his new book, he feared, hadn't been much read. As one year's winner falls into obscurity, and this year's winner certainly should, he thought, he may be beat in the long run by a writer who'd been awarded nothing, who toiled by day in an insurance office and published only in small magazines. Wallace Stevens, for Christ's sake, who died without ever having stepped foot in Europe. Martin understood all too well that it was possible to go to sleep believing you were king of the world and to wake up a cockroach trawling the ruins of Ozymandias. The poet's wife spent the days of her visit in the small makeshift library that had once been the mansion's stables. Sitting on an old chair with arms wide enough to hold a teacup, it reminded her of Russian summer dachas she'd never seen but read about. She'd imagined that year after year, books were taken down off these shelves and read by new generations. But on inspection, many of the books did not seem to be taken down. She was usually the only one in the sunny room. Some of the older novels had lyrical titles: Early Autumn, The Keepers of the House, Edge of Sadness, Years of Grace, Now in November. Many of them were written by women who seemed to publish with three names. Were the three names their married and maiden names? If she'd ever written a book, as she'd once intended to, she wondered, what name would she have published it under? By now, she'd been June Kerrigan longer than she'd been June Barnes. There was something dismaying about so many forgotten books in a place meant, paradoxically, to be a nursery for future books, books being written now with the hope of someday being read and cherished. No doubt, she thought, each of these books had marked a punctuation in the writer's life. A celebratory supper the day the acceptance telegram arrived from New York, fireworks set off by a proud husband, perhaps the author in question going to Cincinnati's swankest store and purchasing a new dress for the book party. What would the authors think of those celebrations now? Would they feel ashamed of how proud they'd been, or glad that they'd made the most of a transitory happiness? Certainly, almost certainly, they'd feel useless. She'd read that Tolstoy, upon serializing Anna Karenina, went from his country dacha to St. Petersburg and fitted himself out with a new fur coat and fashionable matching hat. That was literary history. But what about the purchase of a new dress for the Cincinnati celebration of Mrs. Edna Frances Whitmore for the publication of her novel, The Wind in the Wheat? No wonder she hadn't seen Nell in this library. The greatest victory that young woman could imagine was probably a letter of acceptance from a New York publishing firm. It would be terrible to see your dream mocked before you'd even begun to attain it. Worse than the thought of those premature celebrations was the certainty of sacrifice. Who knows how many sacrifices each of these books represented? How many love affairs botched, how many good marriages averted by a man who thought sensibly of what having such an intense wife might bode? How many children complicated by a preoccupied mother? Writers and artists, she supposed, always ran the considerable risk of being made a fool, spending a life creating something they'd hoped to be useful in that most unlikely way of all, by being beautiful, and instead found themselves having given up years to a volume that lives only on the shelves of a summer library, not even picked up by the putative granddaughters of the authors themselves. These books probably scared the young writers. They all wanted to end up Tolstoy and stood the considerable chance of becoming Edna Frances Whitmore. The night of that reading was 50 years ago. The colony is still operating, though changes have been made. More artists of color are invited now. Nell has heard more women, more people from states west of the Mississippi. The converted mansion still has a summer season of composers, artists, and writers, to which they've added writers for the screen and cartoonists. They still serve eggs for breakfast, though the woman known for the bread pudding had long ago retired and by now has almost certainly died. The poet who'd snubbed Louise Davis died early, still in his 60s, but after a thick volume of his selected work had been published and won a posthumous prize. Nevertheless, that book, along with his 8 others, could sometimes be found in book bins for $1.99. Whenever Nell saw one, she bought it. Nell herself is an old woman now. Her premonition that night proved true. Her life did change after that summer. Her novel sold, was optioned to the movies. She was soon able to get a better apartment. She did not make the sacrifices the old painter had spoken of in the laundry room. She's been married twice, has a daughter from each of those unions, and in fact talks with both men every day, though she is no longer married to either. Nell realized long ago that she didn't enjoy fame, the singularity of it, enough to work alone for decades the way Louise Davis had, keeping a notebook by her ironing board, getting up while it was still dark to get in 2 pure hours. Louise hadn't told Nell those things. She'd read them in an interview. Nell disliked isolation, not to mention ironing. She liked being one within a group. After her book was made into a movie, she moved to Los Angeles in time to become one of the first female showrunners of what is now considered television's golden age. She never did sell the painting once left on her pillow. After her second marriage broke up, she asked an assistant to research the artist and learned that he'd been poisoned by gases released from overheated beeswax used in the encaustic process. Neuropathy paralyzed his legs. She wrote to him, care of an online gallery based in Florida that sold his work, but never heard back. Occasionally, during stray moments, she finds bits about him on the internet. He painted a series of disabled rodeo riders. My work has become about compassion, he said in the article. Compassion for others, compassion for oneself, for a painter who was reckless enough to hurt himself doing what he loves most. Even after all that, he was still painting. She'd told people, especially the young women in her writing rooms, that she'd once been at a colony and given a reading with Louise Davies. It was a network television ending, she thought, that what was still read were not the poems of the man who'd snubbed her, but the stories of that housewife from Georgia. Nell reads those stories now when she has trouble falling asleep. She's read each of the collections but cannot find the one about the sister and the brother who lived in the old house they'd grown up in. She longs to know what happened to them. Thanks. Oh, I've now got 2 cups of water.
Oh, yeah, but you should be hydrated.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Is that on?
Are these on?
Yours
Are they
sounds
working?
on. Does mine sound on? Yeah, great.
Good.
That was great.
Thank you
for having me here.
Thank you for being here.
And also, I think, so you sent me this earlier today so that I could prepare, and it's quite similar to your novels in the structure, even though it's very compact, but it weaves in a very small space, lots of perspectives, lots of generations, and sort of a wide time frame that includes the retrospective, I guess. And I was wondering, is it part of a novel?
It is not.
It's not. Did you write it here?
Yes, I wrote it here.
But you are trying to start a novel.
Yes, I was trying to
You have
start
three
a novel.
ideas.
Yes, I came with 3 ideas, and I've been actually, contrary to this story, I've been working sort of every day on those 3 ideas.
Okay. But what does would you say what the ideas are, and then I can ask you my
Sure.
vague process.
Well, the first one, and the one that I'm working on the most at the moment, is about 2 women who were profound influences on the thinking and policy and legacy, really, of our arguably our second greatest president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and after Lincoln, I think probably. So we can maybe agree is our second most important.
We can debate it afterwards.
We can. But the 2 women are his wife Eleanor and a woman named Frances Perkins, who was his first Secretary of Labor. And Roosevelt is an interesting figure. I mean, Oliver Wendell Holmes, our famous justice, once said after meeting him that he's not a first-class intellect, but he has a first-class temperament. Nonetheless, he brought the country out of its worst and most debilitating depression. And really, with the help of Frances Perkins, he introduced legislation that changes the way we work even now. I mean, he introduced what we think of as the weekend, Social Security, minimum wage, all those things. In addition, he did all that, but it's interesting. These 2 women who had a profound effect on him, they each had mothers who were obsessed with the fact, both Eleanor's mother and Frances Perkins's mother were obsessed with the fact that their daughters were not beautiful. I've actually brought a quote from Frances Perkins's mother. She said, "You have a very broad face. Your head is narrower above the temples than it is at the cheekbones. Also, it lops off very suddenly into your chin. Never let yourself get a hat that is narrower than your cheekbones because it makes you look ridiculous." Now, if you see pictures of this woman, this great woman, our first Secretary of Labor, throughout her life, she wore these big hats. She took that in. And in her autobiography, Eleanor wrote, "My mother was troubled by my lack of beauty. She thought I wouldn't have the boyfriends that that the other girls in the family had because I was the ugly duckling." So Franklin, yet despite their, panic about that, Franklin chose Eleanor, and Eleanor, with her influence upon him, encouraged him to choose Frances Perkins. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt chose many other women to be his secretaries and mistresses, a category which sometimes blurred for him. But nonetheless, they were the ones who mattered most to his thinking. At least he chose these other women, it seemed, for a kind of relaxation and play. And one of his daughters said that her mother Eleanor couldn't provide her father what the trivia that he needed. Go figure. Meanwhile, it should be mentioned that early in his career and his marriage, Roosevelt suffered. He was a victim of polio, and his legs became paralyzed, and he really began a lifelong struggle to regain the use of his legs, which he never succeeded with. But so I've been researching those 3 figures very intensely. It's a funny thing to do a historical novel like that, because I don't want to sort of write about them directly. There have been great novels. There's Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, but I would want to get in at them slant in a way. I would want to do it differently.
Why? I know. I mean, the idea of writing a historical novel seems to me like a minefield. I guess
it is a minefield
because so when do you make things up, and at what point are you?
That's exactly. Thing.
It's not like you're tricking. I don't believe if you're reading a novel you can trick somebody, but there is kind of like as a journalist, I'm sort of like, I don't want to present facts that seem factual. Agree. Right. So it is difficult.
No, I remember Yeah, it's always bothered me when people kind of monkey around in novels with the truth, and I wouldn't monkey with the truth. I'm not actually interested in retelling their story as it is known.
Right.
I'm interested in the people around them and the people we don't know about, the helpers.
You still like projecting emotions based on like what
On
you
the-
research,
on the
right?
people?
On any character, right? When you're writing fiction, right? I would consider like when you're writing fiction, you're sort of projecting an emotional reality into the characters, right?
For sure.
Because we can never know anyone, right? So
According to Jenna Malcolm, yes.
yeah. So that to me is what is difficult about it, right?
Well, I think it's particularly difficult if it's somebody who actually is documented, is in the archive. I don't have too much problem with resurrecting people we don't know anything about.
Of course. They might as well be fictional.
Well, and maybe their roles were important. What I mean? Maybe they had contributions which were overlooked. So yeah, so that's the thing I'm struggling with that.
Okay.
Oh, and then just quickly, the two other ideas.
We have to do this.
Yeah, very quickly.
We're going to figure it out today. If
Yes,
we haven't
that would
already
be great.
figured it out yet.
We'll take a vote.
Yeah, that's good.
Then the second idea was two sort of struggling writers. Two middleist writers. One who supports herself by being an adjunct professor at a college. The other of who's a failing bookstore owner. Decide they notice that the romance novels are selling, wildly much more than the literary novels they favor. So they decide to try to collaborate and write a romance novel to make a buck. That was number two. And the third idea was actually based on my mother's later life, which was a story about how dementia could change the end of a 30-year-long love story, or sort of love story, which I guess I could describe in reality. At best it was kind of, I don't know, at best it was unequal, at worst it was, sadistic. Her being the S, him being the M. It was not a pretty relationship. He was unrequited, it was one of these things. But then when she began to lose her memory, everything changed. And suddenly this man who'd sort of trailed after her and done things for her to no effect for all these years, suddenly she had tenderness towards him. And when the Aricept kicked in, especially, she would call him her husband and she would scold him for flirting with the nurses. On the other hand, when she was more clear, it would be back to Jim, why are you wearing that? I've told you not to wear this. So anyway, those are the three ideas.
Have you decided? Don't say which one you've. If so, don't say which. But have you?
I haven't decided, but I've kicked one out.
Okay, I know which one you've kicked out. So tell everyone which one, and then let's talk about why.
I kicked out the middle one about the. Yeah.
Well, when you told me that, I was like, oh yeah. One has novel ideas like that.
I know.
It's like a kind of get rich quick scheme. You're like, I want to write a novel. What would be a good novel? And you're like, two guys, they get in cahoots.
They get in a heist.
It's a buddy comedy.
Yeah.
They're going to write a romance novel. They're going to write like it's like that. It's like kind of one often gets like attached to those little ideas, right?
I thought it'd be like an inverted Sullivan's Travel, that great Preston Sturges movie. But I think it's a good idea. I just don't know if I could write it.
You would have to put the romance novel in there.
Yeah.
And would you want to do that?
I don't know if I could do that, to be honest.
Well, you could. That's why you got to get a buddy in there. You got to get a collaborator.
I don't know. It just, I mean, I think we ultimately write what we can write. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I can write that one. I think the other two I can write.
Yeah, the other two sound more like your work, if I may.
They do a bit.
But so let's talk about the last idea too, because it also, there's also sort of similar, if sort of mirror image problems writing about things from your real life and real people, even if they're dead.
Less if they're dead.
Less if they're, yeah. But there's still this kind of uneasiness that is sort of related to the uneasiness that comes with a historical novel, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think?
I think writing about people you're close to, the main thing I would worry about, honestly, just having been a writer for a while, and having friends who are writers, and having friends who's lost cherished relationships with sisters or family members over this. I think to me the main thing you would worry about is really hurting somebody you love, and there is a moral element to it. I mean, there's no question that it's not a good thing necessarily to do. I've been a friend of mine wrote an essay once called "You've Been Fictionalized," and I've been a character in a friend's novel. I didn't like it, but I think usually by the time something's done, it's really so different. It's not the person.
That's not what
anymore.
people think.
Well, that's what.
That's not what they feel. They really don't. I mean, my experience,
Really?
right? Like the readers, they don't know.
Did you get? Well,
I don't have as much experience, but my
I've,
experience is that people think things that are about them that actually were never about them in the first place.
that's
Yeah.
a problem too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what you do. It's a problematic profession.
Yeah. Okay, so you still have the two.
I still have the two.
And is either of them winning?
I'm spending more time thinking about the Roosevelt novel at the moment.
You did send much more material about that one.
Yeah.
But is this always your process when you start a novel? Do you always have a bunch of things and do you have to write into them?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're really working on them both.
I'm really working on them both.
Okay. And what does that look like? Do you make like a hypothetical outline?
No.
Are you organized at all?
I'm
not.
I'm not especially organized, although I just asked Michael, and I'm going to ask all the historians here today, I think if I keep on with this Roosevelt novel, I really am going to have to get some sort of software or something, because it's really incredible, the dates and the events and I've now read some things that are like 6 versions of it, and they don't all correspond. So I need help.
But that's why you're doing a novel, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose as much. Well, I guess what I was going to ask is, have you ever considered doing either of these as a nonfiction project?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm not interested in the nonfiction aspects of them. I mean, I'm interested in them, but I think that's not what I can do. That's not what I'm really interested in, I guess. I think there's been so much that's good that's been written about, well, probably not about dementia, but I've read some about dementia. I read a lot about it when my mother was losing her memory, but none of it seemed to answer the questions you really wanted to know.
Right.
I always feel, for me, the questions I really want the answers to are in fiction. So that's why I read it mostly and write it. But I don't know. I think I don't know. Do you consider your nonfiction like a whole different country?
No. But I don't. I mean,
you write a lot of.
I write a lot of both.
Yeah.
So, but I think all of my fiction that I've written or am writing is very much related to my life or things that I observe in sort of this contemporary reality. So it doesn't.
What's worked for me is I know I have close friends who've really lost friends over this, but if I use some incident or some part of somebody, I give them a manuscript, before it's published, and if they flip out and there's something that I'll try and, I don't make any promises, but I definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it also depends on what it is, I think.
Yeah.
Who it is.
Yeah. But you're right. You're absolutely right about people getting upset when it's not even them.
Yeah, then you're like, well, I can't do anything. I mean, I think that's sort of the beauty of art. Like, you can't really control people's reaction to it. And if it's good, and people if people identify with things that have nothing to do with them, that's kind of great. That's sort of the point, right? Right.
Unless it's your aunt who's mad at you.
Yeah. So will you start outlining at some point? Like, do you ever make a structure? Just because I think about your novels, the characters really, if you haven't read them, the characters are really interwoven, just like the story. They're really like, the backstories and the perspectives are very not intricate, but they seem very established.
I usually write a draft.
You write a draft.
And then I look and see what I have and cut out a whole bunch of stuff and, figure out what I have to do, which is usually very substantial.
Okay. So do you write the draft quickly?
No, unfortunately. I would like to write the draft quickly.
And is it sort of sentence, like, do you start at the beginning or do you start in the middle, or do you start at what you believe at the start to be, that possibly is the beginning, and maybe it turns out not to be, but you have to sort of start in chronological order, or you just go?
No, I don't care about, I don't fool with that too much. I sort of go every morning, like when it's working all right, I go every morning and I go to sort of the warm spot. And if I've got some idea, I usually come with some patch of something.
Yeah.
And I work there. And then later on I worry about, and then the nice thing about writing this kind of work is it is fiction. Eventually, after a little while, if the book is working, it begins to talk to you. It begins to tell you, it's like a Ouija board or something. It tells you where you should go next.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of trust that.
Mm-hmm. And do you have I always am like, I figured it out. I have like a moment where I'm like, I figured it out. And maybe it's actually been percolating for a long time, but I have moments that feel like inspiration, like it's come to me.
Yeah, once in a while.
A blessing from God or whatever. What about, do you have a psychodrama about narration, which is to say the first person or third person?
I do have psychodramas about narration.
You do?
Sure.
Okay.
How could you not?
Can we talk a little bit more about it? Because I noticed also all your novels that are in first person or have first person, there's always a we in the very first paragraph almost, which is interesting.
I didn't notice that. I don't know. The novel I just wrote that I turned in is in first person.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Roosevelt novel, the way I imagine it, would be in sections with different first persons, probably.
Do you prefer one or the other?
I prefer first person.
Why?
I don't know exactly. I like the demotic. I like idiomatic expressions. I like that. I just like the language parts of it, and so that's fun. But also, I think that really, the movies have done us a lot of harm.
Okay.
Like, I love Thomas Hardy. If you read Thomas Hardy now, those 11, 12 pages of beautiful, incredible description that open the novels. Nobody's going to read that now. They don't. The movies they do that better. So really what we have going for us, and maybe all we have going for us at this point is internality, and so that's usually conveyed by voice, I think. It's helped by voice.
So the poet in the story, she's reading his poems and she's like, oh, it's just landscape. It's just scenery.
Right. Although the older woman sees more in it. She sees more implications.
But is that because, I'm really just making a stretch, but is that because her mind has been shaped by the cinema?
Maybe. Or maybe she's just, she's young. And
not that interested in
she's
scenery.
Young and she's looking for different things than he has to offer, I guess.
Love affairs, I think.
Yeah.
So do you think your writing has, I'm interested in this idea that the movies do scenery better, I guess. They do
I think
a beautiful.
Yeah. I don't think we need to do that now.
I personally don't like to read landscape descriptions for very long. If it's really good, but I feel bad because I'm like, oh, I'm a young person and I hate to read several pages of. If it's old, let's say, if it's Thomas Hardy, that's one thing because you're also reading a historical document on some level. So, so I feel that the experience of those novels is not just as novels, but also as novels that were written in the 19th century or whatever.
No, and it's like buildings. You can't there's a difference between an old building and a fake old building.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes I think that's totally great. Yeah. Which
As
is
Peter will be talking about.
yeah, absolutely. Because you're like, I don't want to read a fake old novel. I want to read a new novel.
Right.
I want to read a novel about now, or I would read Middlemarch, as you do every year, presumably. So do you think that your sort of fiction has adapted to this over the last sort of, I guess you've been publishing novels since what, when was the first one?
Well, actually, it's actually 1987. I don't know why it says 1986 when you Google. I think they were going to bring it out in 86 and it was delayed or something. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've ever been, I was always kind of a dialogue person in the, from the beginning, I think, a little bit. That's what comes easily to me. But yes, I believe that we can't, I do think in terms of, structure and I do think things have to be fresh.
Yeah. So I gotta. So we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Hi, thank you, Mona. It's so wonderful to hear you read, and I can't help but think that the bread pudding has something to do with us here. But yeah, reading into things. But as serendipity has it, I was reading about Eleanor Roosevelt in the last months, but from a totally different perspective, and her capacity as, after the death of her husband, the American representative to writing the Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. And Marianne Reston wrote a book which is titled something like Eleanor Roosevelt and the Making of Human Rights as the subtitle. But when you get into it, what you find out is that actually Eleanor was incredibly intimidated by the other delegates to this convention. She sort of assumed a prominent but largely logistical and organizational role, sort of shied back from some of the conceptual and intellectual arguments that were being made in shaping, this document about Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that this was revealed to the author by what the archive of this particular event may have told her. And we know that she was a strong and intelligent woman, but maybe just following the death of her husband and this tall task of playing on the international stage scared her, or she was somehow intimidated by the others, or felt out of her league, or whatever it may have been. That the historical record revealed that she actually was a little bit of a shrinking violet in this situation.
Well, that's not surprising at all. Actually, reading, from what I've read about her, she was very smart, and she always put herself into that role of being the one who's willing to do the work. Mm-hmm. She didn't seem to trust her intuition as much, and she stayed in the marriage with Roosevelt after they really became sort of almost business partners in a certain way. But she would get at him, but she trusted him to get she would bother him at night when he wanted to be playing Chinese checkers. She would be bringing up, have you made sure that are you pushing that legislature through? But she didn't seem to have the confidence ever to fully get out front.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the second part of the question then is, sorry. Yeah, go further. That's fine.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Mona. That was terrific. And I really, thank you for putting me in your story. but more than that, as we've talked before, I really love the Roosevelt women part. And I think what you did in your story points to exactly what art can do for history. That you can get your people at different points in their lives at the same time. It's a wonderful way of working with time and with people. So please do the Roosevelt one.
Well, just as an example of the kind of neat things that there are is like, so Roosevelt was obsessed with regaining the movement in his legs. So he went to this place in the South which had mineral baths, and there was a young teenage boy who helped him get in and out of baths. Who was like an African American boy. He was is like his main compatriot in this urge to get better. Then when he became the vice president, when he went on the campaign to be vice president, the boy moved off, and that was the end. But I mean, he was central to that part of that time in his life. There was also a mistress secretary, a mistress secretary, both, who was sort of his White House wife, because Eleanor was off doing other things, and she was with him for 20 years and ended up kind of dying tragically because she was so upset that they didn't kind of retire and get married. So there were all these other people who played a big part in it, which is interesting, I think.
Anybody? Jess and then Jennifer. I'll pick my friends.
Do all the American writers in Berlin know each other?
Yeah, I think we're trying to stage at least I'm trying to stage a glamour coup.
I think it's
usurp
succeeding.
New York and London as the center of literary life in the Anglophone world. So if you'd like to join the movement, contact me afterwards.
I think I shall. Who can resist?
Thank you, Mona. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
A process question. I'm just curious about how you go about figuring out what a voice sounds like for one of your characters, and how you recognize when you've arrived at it, and what the ways you sort of test that out as it's happening.
A lot of reading aloud, I think. And that's really just kind of an intuitive thing, but a lot of reading aloud. I wish I had a more elaborate.
Hi, Mona.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this lovely reading and conversation, and thank you as well, Lauren. I have a bit of a question on the subject of morality, because you touched on it a little bit when you spoke about when people work in their friends or their families into their stories. And everybody likes to think of history as being something that's set in stone, not open for interpretation, but clearly that's not the case. So when you're dabbling in the subject of nonfiction, I'm wondering if there is any moral ambiguity you feel in, or historical fiction, when any moral ambiguity you feel when talking about people who really lived and then putting them in a fictionalized setting. And I ask that question specifically because I know how attached people can become just to fictional characters and how they're interpreted, say, in like TV or film. And I've never met anybody more rabid than a historian who wants to have a lecture on a historical fiction novel. So I'm just wondering how you would.
That's really interesting. I'd love to hear a historian give a lecture on a historical fiction novel.
So would I.
But I mean, it's interesting. Nell gave this brilliant talk in which the question of some kinds of I don't know, resurrections or something have been done in a historical context. And I thought that, Nell, you were rather very, very generous about that. To me, like, for example, Raymond Carver, a great short story writer, wrote a short story about Chekhov's death. And for whatever reasons, he added a character who wasn't in the archive, wasn't in any of the history books. He added a character. He wanted another character in his deathbed scene. So he put one in. It's a great story. However, Janet Malcolm, in her little Russia novel, in her little Russia travelogue of when she goes to see the Yasnaya Napoleona and all that, and she found that several books and biographies have been published since about his death that include this fictional character. So, I mean, I do take it fairly seriously. I think it's truly a danger. And I don't, that's why that's part of my hesitation with this project, because I remember, I feel there is.
No, don't hesitate.
Okay.
I wasn't saying you should hesitate. I was just
if you're worried.
But I think you're right. I think there are moral qualms one should have.
Hi, Mona. The story was really very, very beautiful. And it made me think of a lot of things. And one of the things that it made me think of was one of the things that I think it captured so beautifully was this sort of competing sense of both the artist's desire to create meaning and the very real possibility / perhaps suspicion at times that it's all futile. There's some sort of like a sense of futility and a kind of sadness about, the fact that there's just so many damn books, which is both amazing and also, you're sort of a drop of ink in the ocean kind of thing. So I just wondered if you could sort of talk about that over the course of a career, thinking about futility and meaning in the sort of the making of art, as you did so beautifully in that story.
Well, I'll tell you one funny thing about that story. That when the woman is in the library and she sees all these books with the lyrical titles that nobody's reading, I just put in all of those books that you've never heard of are Pulitzer Prize winners. So I came across that fact because I had to give away the LA Times Fiction Prize, and I wanted to. I wanted to sort of put prizes in context. It probably wasn't the best fact to mention in that particular context, but Ayanna, our mutual friend Ian, says that publication is the price we pay for getting to do what we like most of our lives. I mean, there is constantly that feeling of, and I think most artists work really hard. So I think there is a sense that they're ambitious people to some extent, and there are so many things this world needs, and we're not. I mean, I'm in an English department, which is always kind of hilarious because there's all these people who are rabid about things, but I always feel like, well, I get it about climate change. I get it why you're rabid, but really, why are you writing about animals in 19th century novels? You should be really out there, enacting policy or something. So there's a lot of things we're not doing. We're not in hospitals. We're not on the front lines. We're not doing so many things that, yes, sometimes when you feel like, who's going to read this thing, you do feel that. But I think on the other hand, I bet most of us in this room were in one way or another saved by art or by literature. So by a book, by a teacher who gave us a book, by those things. So there's also that, and that's just the balance that we're always going to be facing. And I don't think it's ever going to be resolved. I don't think you're going to wake up one morning and say, it's okay, I've made the right choice. I shouldn't have gone to medical school.
Do you really not? You don't feel like you made the you don't feel totally certain?
Not every day. No. That would be boring.
So thank you so much for the reading. One of the things I was really interested to track in the story is the ambivalence that Nell and Louise have about the poet's response to their work, right? And it made me think more broadly. It's kind of a genre question having to do with your own sense of who your most important readers and who the most interesting interlocutors are. So I guess this is a question about for you rather than about the story, which is that have the most meaningful readers been within the field of fiction or other artists, or is it not discipline or genre?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. In terms of the story, I was thinking of it a little bit in terms of gender. In my lifetime, things have changed so much. I remember I was at Berkeley, and one of the high moments of my life was I won a prize for fiction, and it was an amount of money, and I could go to Europe for the summer, and all that was great. But it all got kind of soured for me or complicated because this teacher I just had him once. I didn't even notice him. He was sort of an older guy, not that much. He was in his 40s probably. Much younger than I am now. But he was one of the judges, and he complimented me, and then he invited me to Europe with him for the summer, which then made me realize, maybe I didn't deserve that prize. Maybe I didn't really get that prize. And that kind of thing just was very common in those days. And I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, all the stories I got from these freshman and sophomore girls were about their affairs with 65-year-old men. And I went to the department chair and I said, I'm concerned about this. And he sort of leaned back in his chair and he said, the first student I had an affair with, and began to tell me they were still good friends, and it was a wonderful story. Of course, Hannah Arendt and Heidegger were evoked. And, so things have changed. So I wanted to just, I guess I was touching on that. In terms of my most important readers, from all over, I feel like I'm not a good judge of that. Like I remember there was a guy who was I thought was kind of heckling me almost at a reading once at a bookstore in Chicago. And then he wrote this beautiful letter, and my second book, he named his daughter after the character. And so I don't even know, I'm just grateful I have readers, any.
Yeah, I was thinking, in terms of your own describing, having started as a poet before turning to writing fiction.
Well, writing fiction is becoming increasingly, I think, like writing poetry was. I think writing poetry, you don't really necessarily expect to have wide readership. And I think, I don't know. I mean, if my daughter's generation she's 24, is an example. I don't know. We'll see. But I think, poetry is thriving. I don't think that poetry has died. At one time, poetry was the main form, Look at the bards and, look at but it doesn't mean that there's not great poetry being written now and appreciated, but I don't, great academic books are very meaningful, but they may not have large readers at the time.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the pressures of being a writer. I also, like many here in this room, it seems very much like the character of the poet from Kentucky and the descriptions of how other people were looking at him, the thoughts about prizes and awards and the internal hierarchies of this world. Here in Germany, we've just had a bit of a discussion after the German Literary Award, where one of the shortlisted writers stormed out of this award ceremony complaining that his book was really the best and should have won the award, which it didn't. And then he gave a number of interviews afterwards repeating it and saying that, if he'd won the award, he would have sold much more copies and he would have been able to pay for his financial debt. So, and what I want to say is, it's not to comment on this writer or the other one, but I think there's so many things at play here, like the competitiveness, the silent rankings, or kind of like manifest rankings when it comes to bestseller lists and so on, and people who have a great reputations towards others who don't. I don't know how you look at these things. How would you describe them?
I think the only sort of sane, rational way to look at them is probably by looking at history, and there certainly were writers, Dickens, Tolstoy, George Eliot, great writers who had great fame and great acclaim and huge readerships in their own lifetime. There were also great writers for whom that was not the case at all. Some of my favorites, in fact, like, for example, Henry James died, saying his greatest success was for Daisy Miller, which is actually about Americans living abroad, and it was a relatively, I think any of you who are Jamesians would agree that it's a very minor part of his work. It was the only piece he ever wrote that really took off and sold, and his late great novels, which we all love and read now, it just they didn't sell. And he then at the end of his life put together all of his work and wrote prefaces and did revisions, and his friend Edith Wharton, who had a little more success than he did, got a sort of a collection, and they had to pay the publisher to publish him, and it still didn't sell anything. And he died saying, will there be nothing for me? I mean, and Melville, many great writers did not chime with their times, but yet we're reading their books now. So what can one do? I think one just has to, and you don't have a choice, really. I mean, you could, like those writers, in my second idea, you could try to write something for the market, but that doesn't, I mean.
Also, you have to use a fake name. I mean, I know, there's a very, very famous thriller writer that many people will know who did this.
Really?
As a scheme, and very famous.
Wait, a literary writer?
Who was failing, and they were like, I'm just going to do a thriller.
And then what happened after that? Did they write back to literary novels?
No.
They just stuck with the thriller?
She's still going.
She went over to the other side.
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe
well, that's okay
she's
for her.
Doing literary novels that no one has heard of.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's almost a different thing. I mean, I think for most of us, we kind of want it both ways. That's the thing, is we want to write what we want to write, but I don't want to write a formula. Most of us don't. We want to write what we want to write, and we hope that'll sell a lot of copies. I think that you just can't. You can't go there. You kind of have to. You have to be the. I don't know. I remember sitting with a friend of mine at some point in Palo Alto years and years ago, and deciding sort of what we wished our next books could be and what they were coming out as. They weren't coming out the way we'd wanted. I think, especially as women, so often your books are considered, domestic or this or that, about family, which, well, it's true, my books are about family, but it's also true that practically every novel is about family. And they say that with women in a way that it somehow comes out different. Anyway, if I wanted to be a great war novelist, that's nice, but I don't think I could be a great war novelist. Your only chance at a really authentic experience is to write what you have to write and what only you have to write, and then you just have to have faith in that. And if nobody else likes it, you write the next one.
I wanted to ask about two images in this story. One is Tolstoy's fur coat, and the other is the dress from the fancy shop in Cleveland. And if this was an explicit contrast, speaking to some of the issues you mentioned a moment ago with male and female writers, if this was meant to sort of point up the vanity of writers, the kind of concerns with status and self-reward, or if it's kind of claiming the mantle of Tolstoy. If you do it, you have to sort of try in that direction. But
Is it that terrible? Is it that vain to buy a dress or a fur coat? I don't know. Fur coat, I wouldn't do.
Nice. I thought it was
nice
both
too.
celebrating, but
they were celebrating.
Treat Tolstoy's as like a grand gesture, and this lady, mid-century lady from Cincinnati.
Now she was made up, I will say.
Yeah, but you were assumed at least one of the Pulitzer Prize-winning ladies bought a nice dress.
I'm sure they did. I believe they did, and I'm glad they did, and I hope they did.
I'm buying them all the time.
Yes, I mean, I think I meant it. I kind of meant it as like. Yeah, I mean, it does take courage in a way to celebrate your own life. It's a lot easier to celebrate your life if the world is like that young man you were talking about, who was telling everyone it would have been so much better if his book had won the prize. A part of me is just in awe of how he got that confidence. His mother must have done something.
He's not young. He's not young, right? He's medium. Yeah, he's not a young.
The German literary world, that's kind of.
Yeah, it's younger.
Yeah.
But you're imagining like a young guy who.
I would still think anybody saying that. You know, it's kind of a I don't know. It's kind of a.
Oh, I like the spectacle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I will say that a friend of mine who was a guest editor recently, and she said that when she would reject a story by a man, if she wrote a nice note, she would get another story within the week, sometimes FedExed. When she would reject a story from a woman with the same level of encouraging note, often she never heard again. So I think I am kind of fascinated by that kind of gender split with confidence, especially since I teach and I see that all the time.
So do we have time for one more? One more question in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was sort of curious about the other story, not the writing a romance novel, the memory one. I was thinking of Nell's project and how place shapes how we think. And I was thinking also, since I've been here in Berlin, there's such beauty to the culture around memory here. And it costs me something as a Jewish person navigating all this memorializing. And I was thinking about my grandfather, as you were speaking, I was thinking about my grandfather and how, I swear there's a question here. He was thinking about my grandfather and how as he had dementia and he forgot, he became more of himself also. And he had a lot of trauma. So it's making me wonder, as you were talking, is there something about writing about forgetting here and maybe even the value of forgetting?
Absolutely. I think there's a beautiful book about that, I think, by Lewis Hyde. It's kind of a complicated title, and I'm forgetting it now. Has anyone read it?
Letting go.
It's a great book about the cost of memory, really, and the beauty of the possibilities opened by sometimes not remembering. Of course, it goes into the forgiveness movement and it goes into it in sort of a deep way. I sometimes feel reading about the forgiveness movement that sometimes it just feels like a matter of nomenclature, like, you know, I can forgive you, but I don't have to have a relationship with you. You know, it seems like sometimes we're just parsing, but he goes into it very deeply and sort of what's gained by a kind of oblivion, by sometimes some things have to be forgotten. There's a new book by Adam Phillips too, the British psychoanalyst I admire, called On Giving Up, which I think is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.